delighted that you're here. My name is Susan Carrier. I'm the Director for Award. And I'm going to present this report that was published together with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, represented right here, and the University of Greenwich, Natural Resources Institute of the University of Greenwich, and Award. And it's the status of women in agri-food systems in sub-Saharan Africa. And so in 2023, FAO produced a report. It was called The Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems. It was a global report. And after they presented, we felt that it was really important to do an Africa-specific report. So this is what it is. It provides up-to-date evidence on the status of women in agri-food systems in sub-Saharan Africa, giving very Africa-specific recommendations and policy highlights on how to promote agenda, climate, and environmentally just agri-food systems in sub-Saharan Africa. This work is funded by IDRC, so thank you very much, IDRC. And I'll just give some of the key highlights and I'll go quite quickly. So the first thing the report talks about is to what extent women contribute to the labor force in agri-food systems. And the report finds that 49% of agri-food systems workers in sub-Saharan Africa are women. This is 9%, if you look over here, it's 9% than the global average. And women make up 43% of agricultural workers when you look at crop production, livestock production, fisheries, and forestry. So a huge amount of workers. The highest is in East Africa with 47%, as you can see from here. And then on the other hand, they also make up 63% of the off-farm agri-food systems workers. So we are talking about processing, we're talking about all the other work that comes beyond primary production. And here the highest is in West Africa. West Africa, of course, has a culture of selling food in the streets, etc. So there's a huge number of off-farm agri-food systems workers in West Africa. The second thing that the report talks about is that agri-food systems are really important for women's livelihoods. And we find that agri-food systems is the largest employer of both men and women in sub-Saharan Africa. It employs 76% of men and 68% of women. Again, highest levels here are in Central and East Africa with about 81%, West Africa 78%. Now, one of the things that we find in the report is that agriculture employment is going down and off-farm agri-food systems employment is going up, and it has grown in many parts of Africa. This is from the policies that we have on commercialization. There's also demand for food away from home, so with increasing incomes. The highest here of farm agri-food systems employment is in West Africa with 47%. What the report also finds is that women's work in agri-food systems is very diverse. So they are producing, processing, they're distributing, they're also involved in consumption, packaging, but it's also food crops and cash crops. However, the report finds that women who work in agri-food systems face often precarious conditions. They are overrepresented amongst the irregular workers, informal workers, they are lower paid, they're part-time, and they're lower skilled, often facing much poorer working conditions than men. Actually, one of the interesting things the report finds is that nearly 90% of employed women in sub-Saharan Africa work in the informal sector. What this means is there's no statistics that's talking about their contribution. There's no social protection. So really the informality is a big issue and we need to pay attention to that. The other thing that the report really highlights is that women spend more time on unpaid and care work than men. And what this does is it limits their participation in other things, in remunerative work, but also even leisure. And finally, that they face unhealthy and unsafe working conditions, where harassment, even in markets, and gender-based violence are quite prevalent. The other topic the report talks about is food insecurity. And it finds that food insecurity is increasing for both men and women, and sub-Saharan Africa continues to face the highest levels of food insecurity of any region in the world. But the report also finds that women experience more food insecurity than men. So there are gender gaps in terms of that, and that there are about 11.2 million more women than men who are food insecure. Central Africa has the highest levels, the worst levels of food insecurity. Of course, this has to do with conflict that's happening there. When we talk about climate change and its impact on women and girls who are in agri-food systems, the report finds that women in agri-food systems are at highest climate risk. This is because they depend on agriculture and the climate. So when you look at the extent of the climate hazards they face, the exposure, but also to what extent they're vulnerable, again, we find that women in agri-food systems are at highest risk. Climate crisis increases women's workloads, it increases gender-based violence, things such as child marriage, trafficking or survival sex become more predominant. Again, one of the big issues is that the existing structural inequalities in terms of access to land, access to information, make women worse off and less able to adapt. And then this map looks at the hotspots of where women are most at risk. And it finds that when you look at climate, agriculture, and gender inequality overlaid, we find that women who are in agri-food systems are at highest risk. And countries that are highest risk are the Sahelian countries, the ones in red, the semi-arid regions. When we look at women's land rights, the report also finds that women's land rights, women lag behind men in terms of secure rights. So one of the things the report talks about is that women in agricultural households are significantly less likely than men to own land or to hold secure rights to land. So when you look at one of the SDG sub-indicators that looks at land rights, the report finds that in 28 out of the 33 sub-Saharan African countries that had reported, a larger proportion of men own land compared to women. And then when you look at the other indicator that looks at legal protections for women's land rights, the report finds that legal protections for women's land rights are low or none in 13 out of the 28 countries that have reported. So again, this is looking at the gap between men and women in terms of owning, and you can see it's a huge gap. The other thing the report also looks at is access to extension, to information, to financial services, to mobile phones, which are now used for access to extension services. And it finds that, number one, men outpace women in access to agriculture extension and advisory services across the board. One of the biggest challenges here is the lack of sex disaggregated data so that we can actually put real numbers. So the importance of collecting that data. The report finds that only 49% of women had a financial account in 2021 compared to 61% of men. Women were 13% less likely to own a mobile phone and 29% less likely to use mobile internet. So when you see people saying we're using ICTs to increase access to information, then they have to think about ways that they take the smartphone that allows them to do this. The report also finds that women produce considerably less because of these inequalities. And then one of the big issues that Doreen was talking about is women's participation and leadership in agri-food systems. Where are they? Where are these women? And so we use this as a proxy. We look at the share of female researchers as a proxy for the gender gap in research capacity. And we find that when you look at these numbers here, and it's really nice because it's one of the first times we have data from 2011, 2014, 2016, and 2021. And it shows there's still a huge gender gap in terms of researchers, but also leadership in sub-Saharan Africa. On this, the average here shows for 2021, the proportion of women agricultural researchers averages around 22%. Really low. There's some countries that have done quite well. There's countries like Liberia. I think the other Cape Verde also has really good statistics. But on average, the numbers are very poor. And one of the things that we find, and the report really puts meaning to this, is this progressive reduction in women's participation as you go up the postgraduate ladder. So, at bachelor's in agriculture, you have 50% graduating, but master's level, those numbers go down to 40. And when you look at PhD level, it's around 28%, so really low. And what this means is that there is no pipeline of women to take up these roles, these leadership roles, so leading to the underrepresentation. This data is only available for Central and West African countries. As yet, we don't have the 2021 data for the other regions of Africa. And then the report highlights the role that gender-based discriminatory norms play in terms of exacerbating inequalities that persist across many countries. And gender norms influence, they define the roles. So when we're talking about domestic care work, they limit access and use on decisions around labor, around assets, around resources, around information, around mobility. They influence decisions around women's own bodies, what food is consumed and by whom. And really what we are finding out, yes, gender norms can shift, but the process is very slow. So as I close, the report highlights 10 areas where action is needed. The first one is the report talks about making gender equality and women's empowerment a mandatory part of food security and nutrition policies and country actions. And we think here the Kampala Declaration really offers us an opportunity to start to put gender at the center of agri-food systems policies. The second one, it's important to enhance women's access to secure and decent employment, making sure that we are paying attention to the informality. As I've said, 90% of women are employed in the informal sector. But also making sure that we're collecting data on that as well. The third one is we need to strengthen women's land, water, and forest rights, but also their leadership in climate and environmental governance. We need to make sure we're also capitalizing on their knowledge and the traditional roles that they play so that we can strengthen that. We need to recognize and alleviate women's unpaid care work. Here, a big issue is around developing care policies, and many countries are beginning to develop that. But there's also issues around child care, elder care, health care, that can really go a long way in reducing women's unpaid care work. We need to promote equal access to resources and services, including financial services. And it's really important here to think that when you work with women to increase the access to services and resources, that you're using multi-dimensional interventions because women face multiple constraints at the same time. The third one is really expanding and tailoring social protection to reach women in agri-food systems, especially those in the informal sector, and using that to really address some of the constraints they face. It's important to enhance women's participation and decision-making at all levels, in their homes, in their communities, in the institutions, but also at policy levels. And part of this is also building their skills and their self-confidence so that they can participate effectively. Number 8, strengthening women's groups and fostering women's leadership and collective action in agri-food systems, and making sure we're leveraging on existing groups that exist. And number 9, preventing and addressing gender-based violence. And I think a big part of this is also working with norm keepers and men and boys as allies. There are other policy highlights. I'll see Clara wondering where the rest are, but I chose to just present these ones. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susan, especially just for highlighting what the evidence is telling us. You know, what is the data saying? So that our conversation, even as we go forward, is really grounded on data, on evidence. And I think for me, what is standing out from this report and from this evidence is that this issue is not just about women's participation in agri-food systems. If you look at all the 9 policy recommendations that have been presented here, and as you hear, there's more, but if you just look at even the 9, you can see that this is more about a development imperative. Yeah, because it touches on women's participation in decision-making, unpaid care work, participation in the informal settlement, land rights. So it's a development imperative. And so to help us reflect on what this evidence means or the implications for this report in Africa's development agenda, I'd like to invite Dr. Jemima Njuki, the Director for Gender, Women and Civil Society at the Africa Development Bank, to help us unpack this and what this means for Africa, and especially in the context of the International Year of Women Farmer. What do we need to be prioritizing? Welcome, Jemima.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. And let me thank Award for convening us to talk about this important topic. As you've heard, I'm Jemima Njuki. I'm the Director for Gender, Women and Civil Society at the African Development Bank, based out of Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire. We've heard the data, but let me also ground this in the reality of women farmers on a daily basis, because I grew up on a farm. I grew up on the slopes of Mount Kenya, and growing up in the early 1980s, agriculture formed the backbone of my daily life. And what I recall very clearly is there's really extensive knowledge of farming that my mother had. You know, she would select varieties, maize varieties, depending on the prediction they had of how much it would rain, how long it might, the season might last. They would even predict to the day when the rains would come. And they would actually then work backwards and plant 2 to 3 days before the rains came. And what would happen is that then the crops would germinate. It would be the right varieties that are adapted to what that prediction was. And this was really important for maintaining household food security back in those days. And despite lacking formal agricultural training, she and other women really closely aligned farming practices with climatic patterns to promote crop success. So my mother, I believe, and millions of other women in Africa have been custodians of resilience and adaptation long before we even knew what to call these things, long before they became part of policy discussions. Women have consistently played a pivotal role in climate resilience and adaptation. They have drawn on their deep understanding of environmental patterns and agricultural cycles. And yet, as we have heard from the data, despite their leadership and first-hand experience in managing climate risks, they remain largely absent from the global and regional making spaces that address climate change and agri-food systems. And this exclusion persists even as the impacts of climate change continue to affect them most acutely. And what we know, and I'm sure we are all in this room because we strongly believe that, is that if we are serious about climate resilient agri-food systems, we cannot overlook the leadership of the very people who are producing the food that we eat based on the data that we have seen. And so elevating women as actors in climate action is not simply about supporting a vulnerable group. I have never considered my mother, may God rest her soul in peace, a vulnerable person, but a leader in adaptation, a leader in resilience. It is us, the policy processes that we have, it is the systems that we have that are exposing them to that vulnerability. So this is about strengthening the resilience and sustainability of Africa's food systems. As Doreen said, this conversation is particularly timely now in the context of the International Year of the Woman Farmer, which reminds us of the immense contribution that women are making to agri-food systems that extend beyond production, as we have seen, because they are processors, they are traders. Those of us in this room that grew up in some rural part of Africa, we know we went to school. We had uniform, we had shoes, we had books, because our mothers traded in crops, in chickens, in goats, and in livestock. They are community leaders, they are innovators. They shape how food is moving across markets and how households adapt to climate stress and how whole communities respond to environmental challenges. And for us at the African Development Bank, it is really a core belief that we have to put women at the center of the continent's transformation. We have a 10-year bank strategy that really positions gender equality and women's empowerment at its center. We have a gender strategy whose objective is to reduce gender inequality and promote women to participate across the priority areas that the bank works in. And one of those priority areas is agriculture and human development. And interestingly, at the bank, we put agriculture and human development together because we know those two are closely linked. We recognize the sector is one of the major sources of income and livelihoods for people and for women in the continent. We know there are barriers that they face. And so if you will allow me to really just share very briefly some of the work that we are doing to advance women's leadership in agri-food systems and climate action. I'll mention a couple of projects, and because for us, these are really important projects, because some of them really are implemented in some of those hotspots that Susan showed. We are working in the Horn of Africa to enhance the resilience of agro-pastoral and pastoral communities with very, very targeted interventions focused on women. We are working in countries like Ethiopia on a climate resilient wheat value chain development project that's working with over 250,000 women smallholder farmers, making sure they have the right seeds, they have the right fertilizer, they have access to irrigation. We are in 14 countries in West Africa, including the ones in the Sahel, on a program on strengthening adaptation to climate change of the rice value chain, one of the value chains that's been really affected by climate change in the region. And this is one of the very holistic one that's taking women all the way from production to processing to marketing, including increasing their access to finance as for women-owned enterprises. I can go on and on and on, Agriculture is one of our biggest investments in the bank. But what I really want to emphasize is that we are deliberately making the efforts to close the gap for women in all our financed projects as we set out in this 10-year strategy. But we know we are not alone in this process, and I'm sure that's why all of you are around the table. And I would like to just call on us to prioritize 3 key things. One is to really continue to advance women's leadership in climate action. We need to strengthen their access to climate resilient resources and technologies. And whether this is climate smart agricultural practices, seeds, but even as we talk about women in leadership position, we cannot also forget that women continue to produce the food that we eat. The second thing is really investing in women's leadership. As we have seen, that is really going to be critical in terms of how we achieve change, because we've seen they are not only producers of food, but also leaders in agricultural research, in agribusiness, in innovation, and they must be present also in policy spaces. And that really addressing some of these structural barriers that limit women's full participation, whether it's the care policies we are starting to see take root in the continent, whether it's the energy that we need to make sure that women are not spending a lot of time cooking and cleaning. So it's really making sure that we are providing the infrastructure, and this is another important part of the bank, providing the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, the market infrastructure, the road infrastructure that women really need to thrive in this space. And because I'm a storyteller, I'm going to finish with a very short story, if you allow me, Doreen. Because last week, before the floods hit Nairobi, I was talking to my auntie who I am named after. And she was very excited because the rains had finally come, but also very worried because they had come earlier than anticipated. As you know, the conversation goes, once you say hello, then the next topic of conversation is usually the weather. So we got to start to talk about the rain. But that was her worry, that the rains are not following the patterns that they had come to understand. You know, they're changing. They're coming earlier than anticipated. And when they come early, they also end early before the crops have had a chance to grow. So the seasons are shifting. But even as the seasons shift, women are continuing to innovate, because the next story she then tells me is that fortunately, she soaked her maize seed in water before the rains came, so that by the time she planted, the seed was ready to germinate. And so the point I'm trying to make is that women, even in the precarious climatic uncertainty that they face, they are continuing to innovate, and they will continue to innovate, because that is pure innovation, that's adaptation, that's leadership that we need in this sector. So I'll finish by saying, just like my mother and my grandmother before her and my auntie, all finding ways to respond to a changing climate, they continue to lead. And so our responsibility as policymakers, as development partners, as institutions, is to make sure that their leadership is recognized, that it is supported, that it is killed. But because the truth is, women are not waiting to be empowered to lead climate action. They are already leading it. And our task is to sustain that momentum. And it requires us to rethink how we value knowledge, whose knowledge we value, whose leadership we value and elevate. And we cannot continue to look at climate adaptation as a technological intervention alone, because the solutions are also social. The solutions are to be found in the many networks of women. They are rooted in local knowledge, generations of observation and adaptation. And guess who the custodians of all that knowledge is? It's women. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jemima, for your reflections, for sharing, your stories, and actually your closing story about, the rains in Nairobi and the floods is a very good way to segue to Jacqueline. But before transitioning to Jackie, what I want to, I think, emphasize what I'm hearing from you is that, your reflections are reminding us that these issues, what we need to do to move ahead, and I like what you're saying, that women are already leading us in, transforming the food systems, in adapting to climate. They actually don't need empowerment. We need to recognize their contribution, their leadership, their knowledge, their skills, but also to intentionally invest in scaling and sustaining that leadership. You've also talked about partnerships. Everybody here in this room who is representing different entities, I'm sure we all have an interest in that particular area and the need to continue working together. But also you've talked about, addressing these barriers that women face. And I think there's also a bit around accountability when we are addressing those barriers. How are we tracking when we say, beyond the policies, what are we saying we're going to do around supporting these women as leaders? You've also shared about some of the priorities that the bank is working on, positioning women at the center of transformation, just not just agriculture, but actually economic transformation on the continent. So thank you very much for sharing those those reflections. And like I said, when you ended at the floods in Nairobi and the rains that have come earlier, and the need for us to pay critical attention to climate adaptation. So I'm going to transition now to Jacqueline with the rest of my panelists to discuss what this means for us in practical terms. And Jacqueline, who is the Director of Gender Affairs and Affirmative Action, Ministry of Gender, Culture and Children Services in Kenya, you're also the focal point for the UNFCCC National Gender and Climate Change for Kenya. Yeah, and you are a climate fellow, a World Climate Fellow. Among the many things that we do, we are very well known for fellowships, and one of the fellowships that we are offering is around climate adaptation, so accelerating the women's leadership in climate action, where you are a fellow. And one of the things that, of course, we don't even need to overemphasize is the underrepresentation of women in leadership. And drawing from your own journey, what effect does this have on the few women working in these spaces? When you go to the conference of parties discussing climate change and you end up being the only woman at the table, or very few of you, what effect does this have? And then I would like you to share with us, in terms of your own journey growing and getting there, what effect did structured mentoring play in your leadership development?
Thank you so much. And I feel like Jemima already said everything that I would have wanted to say. However, I think I would like to emphasize a few things. And of course, again, drawing from Susan's statistics on participation of women in the actual agricultural practices vis-a-vis the leadership. I think it's something that cuts across sectors, not just in agriculture, and also, of course, now when it comes to climate leadership, again, you see similar trends. So I think from experience, in terms of underrepresentation of women, and as Jemima has said, the women are the nurturers. They nurture all of us, men and women, as the first social agents, as mothers. So that indigenous knowledge that Jemima is talking about, the soaking of seeds, I'm sure the children and grandchildren of that woman are getting that knowledge firsthand. However, the question begs as to what she has said, how does that knowledge influence policies? You know, does that woman's voice ever get to the decision-making table? So when we have that underrepresentation, we are therefore automatically missing out on very critical knowledge, you know, and here we are talking about indigenous knowledge. And I know that even in climate discussions, like there's quite a bit of going back to look at, you know, how can we harness indigenous knowledge, blend it with the science to address the impacts of climate change. So just to re-emphasize, I think that passing over of knowledge and experiences to the boardrooms is missing out when women are underrepresented because they are the social agents. And then Jemima also talked about, and I think even Dr. Karia mentioned about, you know, when those decisions are being made, it's whose voice counts at that table. And we have different lived experiences. Not to say that when men are at the decision-making table, they don't have lived experiences, but the lived experiences are different. So the climate impacts on men and women is different. And therefore, when it comes to making decisions, it counts that both of them are at the table. And also to emphasize that it's important that different intersections of men and women are also at the table, not just women. You know, there are so many different categories of women that should be engaged in policy making processes. So I think I would also, you know, be doing a disservice to my government if I don't mention that, you know, I think as governments we try quite a bit in terms of when we are doing policy development to make it as participatory as possible. And like for Kenya, we have, you know, constitutional provisions and policy provisions in terms of public participation and how public participation forums should be done. Of course, there are efforts towards that, but you'll always find that even in doing that, it's you know, there are gaps in terms of getting everybody's voice on the table. And then just to mention, like in climate discussions, in negotiations where I participate, again, you find quite a bit of gaps in those discussions. And also in terms of decision making, like in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, commonly known as the UNFCCC, we have usually technical negotiations, ordinarily in June, and then the conference of parties, which are policy making forums at the end of the year. Now, there's usually an annual gender composition report that is produced every year just to show the trends in terms of participation and leadership and you know, representation in terms of party delegations. So consistently, the statistics have shown that when it comes to the technical negotiations, women tend to be better represented in terms of numbers, as opposed to the conference of parties, which are policy making forums. What does that tell you? You know, already it's showing you something, because the conference of parties are the most you know, important. Of course, not to say that the technical negotiations are not important, because they are a precursor to the COPs, but it's at the COPs that critical decisions are made. So if they are biased in terms of representation, that men are more than women, then it tells you in whose favor the decisions are made, or who contributes mostly to those decisions. So
okay. I want you to wrap up, because I think that's a really good way transition to Clara.
Yeah.
Because, women, they are doing the work, the technical expertise, they provide all that input. And then when it comes to advancing that to inform the policy decisions or to set the agenda, they're missing. And I think, I just wanted to hear from you, Clara. So we have the International Year of the Woman Farmer. And there's a definition, which we really loved, how you define who the woman farmer is. What is FAO hoping to achieve through this, and why is this moment particularly important?
Yeah, so I think, of course, we decided for the short title, so woman farmer, but it is very important what you said about the definition, that it encompasses women who are producing, who are working as laborers, who are processing, trading, marketing, but also the fishers, the fish workers, the informal workers, the herders, the livestock keepers, as well as the women in agricultural science, because all these are the women who are contributing to agri-food systems. And I think that not knowing how the current context would dramatically shift, in 2024, the UN General Assembly gave us a super important opportunity to really highlight the role that women farmers play, and to put them at the center of what we also aim to achieve, which is the inclusive and climate resilient agri-food system transformation. And I have to say that that impulse came from the evidence that was provided by the status of women in agri-food system that Susan mentioned, because we realized that more than 10 years after the publication of the FAO flagship report on the status of rural women at the time in agriculture, we realized that the gaps that remain were still huge, and that progress was made, but not to the pace and to the level that was desirable, but also needed. So the International Year really gives us an opportunity to highlight the role that women play, their contribution, to make those stories that Jemima was referring to visible and known to a larger public. Because you'd be surprised, while we were organizing all these events, we just had one a few days ago on International Women's Day. Women here, of course, we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, but women from Spain, women from Jordan, women from Egypt, women from Mongolia, they are all facing the same barriers: access to land, access to finance, access to leadership positions. So it really cuts across GDP, economic development. It really tells us that there still remain very important structural and systemic barriers that don't allow us to be the leaders that women deserve to be. Again, going back to what Jemima was saying, the knowledge, the traditional knowledge, but also the innovation that women bring to agriculture is not recognized enough. It's not valued, and it's not used also to the extent that it could. So the status of women in agri-food system also made a very strong business case for why we need to close the gender gap. It showed that by closing the productivity and the wage gap, we could increase global GDP by $1 trillion. And also by making intervention in the agri-food system more focusing squarely on women's empowerment, that we could increase the resilience of 235 million people. That is not small, it's not marginal, it's really important. So in addition to, of course, speaking to the theme of this year's CSW, which is justice. So really making women's rights our first and foremost commitments. And in this case, we're talking about women farmers' rights. There's also a very strong case for why this is important. It's important for women in their own right. It's important for human rights, but it's also important for development, because if we don't do that, we will still be sitting here 10 years from now, maybe not me, but many of you, talking about the same issues over and over again. So I think the International Year is really giving us an opportunity to take action, to bring these stories to the fore, and convince our policymaker that we need more decisive action. And the FAO Commit to Grow Equality initiative, just briefly, is complementary to the International Year. So the International Year does the advocacy, brings the visibility, calls for action, and then Commit to Grow Equality, which is an initiative that FAO launched, brings those commitments to fruition and creates a mutual accountability system. So where the partners who join, they're not accountable to us, to FAO, we are accountable to each other. So FAO has committed to creating, for example, a gender domain in its main statistical database, the FAO Stat. So under the International Year in June, likely we will be launching this new domain that collects all the data and evidence that is available on gender in agrifood system. And again, the data is really crucial for us to be able to make a stronger case.
Thank you so much, Clara. Clara is a senior gender officer at the FAO, and I really like how you've concluded, because data has remained one of the issues that needs more attention, and so we really look forward to the launch of that gender domain. One of the things that you've mentioned, you've touched on the theme of this year's CSW being very timely. And for us, particularly in this conversation, the review theme, which talks about women's full and effective participation and decision-making, is a key theme for us as we continue having this conversation. And I'd like to transition to you, Khadija, when we talk about rights and women's full and effective participation, then land rights remain foundational. And I'd like you to share with us how the Stand for Her Land campaign is mobilizing women to lead advocacy around land rights, and how the people in the room can better support this work.
Thank you so much. This conversation has reminded me of my village. My mother, thank you. So my mother was a teacher. She's a retired teacher, but she loved farming. And so all the titles and were in my father's name. So who decides what to farm was my father. And my father, who decide, had powers to make decision on the cash crops was for him, and the food crops was for my mother. So because she was a teacher, she had money coming from her job. So this day she got her money and she bought a plot of land. And then she made a decision to plant cotton in my village. And there was a big fight. There was a big fight because father knew that mother would get money from the cotton after she harvested and maybe sold the cotton. And then he was like, what is the problem? Because this is my plot. And actually he went ahead and asked me, why did you buy in your name? Because I'm the father, I'm the head of the house. So all the assets are supposed to be in my name. So that is the reality, not only for my mother, but it happens to many women. Even if they have the resources to buy, the social norms do not allow them to own properties in their names. And under the Stand for Our Land now, we are working with women, especially at the grassroots, to make sure that women have secure tenure rights, for them to be able to make decision on what happens with what to farm, what happens with the produce, because they offer their labor in agriculture, but when it comes to who decides what to do with what comes out of their labor, it's not them, because they do not have the titles over that land. So under the Stand for Land campaign, we are working to make sure that all people in the world have a safe and sustainable place to call home. And also women's land rights, property rights, natural resources are equally accessible, owned and controlled by all, by men and women. But again, we believe that women's land rights are foundational to food security, to women's resilience against climate change, but again, peace and security, and even the overall livelihood system. So we are working with grassroots women to push for implementation of the good policies and laws that protect and guarantee women's land rights. But we're also working with grassroots women because they are living the realities at the community level to address the discriminatory customary norms that limit them from owning, from benefiting, and from even taking part in decision-making bodies. In most of the countries, for instance, in Tanzania, the laws specifically provides for women should be part of the land governance bodies. But when you got at the grassroots level, women are not part of the decision-making bodies. Why? Because of the gender roles. Some women refrain, even if they are being asked to be part, they choose not to because they have other roles, care work to do, other than being, even the meetings, the way they're designed and set, the timing, they're not friendly for women to be part of these decision-making bodies. But again, sometimes they're part of the governing bodies, but they do not speak. Why? Because you're not supposed to speak in front of men. And especially if this uncle, your in-laws are there, you'll be considered as like, you are an outcast. So we are making sure that these women are being, they have the capacity, they have the right information for them to effectively participate in decision-making.
I'd like to pause there on the issue of policies and around
Yes.
the implementation of policies, because I think that's a really issue. And also the way you're saying you're using the women in the grassroots to, the way I see it, is to surface some of these issues. What are the realities? So we have the policies, yes. But this is, in Kenya, we like saying on the ground, things are different. So when you go to the ground, these things are different. Because I want to transition to you, Carol, around policies. And you are the chair of Femnet. And civil society movements have been, they've played a very significant role around shifting narratives and influencing policy. We are hearing, issues around policy implementation are huge. And we heard from Jemima around, the need to be accountable. And so I want to ask you, what role must, and I want to say actually African feminist movements, play in sustaining women's leadership? Especially when it comes to what is the policy saying, how might we use those feminist movements to help sustain this, and with respect to agri-food systems.
Okay, thank you so much, Doreen. Listening to the conversation, I almost feel like I can't change what I'm prepared to say. But I'll start with a quote from Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who said that women toil all their lives on land they do not own to produce what they do not control. He said this many years ago. I think it's close to 50 years ago, and that is still true today. So before I say what I want to say, I'd like to invite my granddaughter, who I came with here, to say something very small, because I think it's critical. If we're talking about leadership, we cannot be, I've been coming for CSW for 25 years. The conversation is the same. Something must give. And he.
Thank you. Let me introduce myself. My name is
My name is Akini Murimi. I go to the Lycée Français Denis Diderot, also known as the International French School of Nairobi. I am 12 years old. And as a young African girl, I think it is very important for us to take lead over the older. Because for me, as I see elder women as my aunts, as my elder sisters, as my mothers, as my grandmas, even though we're not actually related. So I think it is very important for them to all like make a deal, set an example of leadership for us. For example, not littering, not recycling, not using single-use plastics. Also, I think it is also important for young girls and young people to have mentors, somebody they can trust. Because for me, that is my real grandma's actually close friend. Her name is Akushila. She has taught me how to journal about my feelings when they get heavy. She has taught me to take care of the environment around us. She has taught me how to plant trees. And I think everyone should have their own Akushila, just not mine, to set a leading example for them. And thank you for listening to me. And I think it is very important for us to have our voice heard and for you guys to set an example for the leading generation. And thank you for your
I brought along because these things that we're talking about, we've lived through them, but they need to change. So what can we do? Feminism is about dismantling patriarchal structures of oppression, of discrimination, and feminists have been around for a very long time. Why is patriarchy still existing? And I think that is why we need to bring in the young people more. When I looked at the topic of discussion, it was about nurturing the next generation of leaders. But when I look around, just doing a clean sweep, I don't think that we have the next generation of leaders in the room.
You do.
And I think we do. I know we have a few, but I would have expected more on the panel. I would have loved to hear your voice. I would have loved to hear your voice. We've got a few. And I think something needs to give, because the women, when I listened to Dr. Jemima speak about her auntie, it really struck me, because the issues about soaking the maize, who's going to document that? Who's going to speak that out for the world to know? And yet that knowledge sits with us. So I've got 6 quick points. Number 1 is that we must advocate for structural and policy reform. We cannot continue to farm on land that we do not own. We cannot continue to live on land that we do not own. And that then adds to the poverty of women. And when we have poverty of women, it will reflect in our food security systems. We know that land is also part of what gives us access to credit. You cannot get credit for land that you do not own. And we need to move from unpaid care work in agricultural systems to where women own and make decisions around that land. So we must advocate for structural and policy change at a very high level, so that we're also dealing with issues of social protection, because we know that older women end up taking care of land for their children, and they do not have any form of care for themselves. The second thing we must do is that we must challenge the gendered norms and shift societal, familial, workplace norms that marginalize women. Because if we do not do that in a structured and effective way, then we will continue to have women tilling land that they do not own, and we'll continue to have Jemima's auntie and her peers with such brilliant knowledge that does not come to inform the data sets that my colleague here was speaking about. The third thing we must do is that we must ensure accountability. We must have better gender disaggregated data and hold public and private sector accountable for creating safe, inclusive and equitable working conditions, including in the agricultural sector. At the beginning, Dr. Susan spoke about what women do across the value chains of the agricultural sector. And we know that this is not always equitable, where women are in the production, but they're not getting value for their money. And then the fourth thing that we must do, and which we're doing as the women's rights movement, is we're trying to foster economic independence, women's participation in cooperatives and other income generating activities to build their financial autonomy. And then the fifth thing we must do is promote agroecology and sustainability. My granddaughter spoke about basics, not littering, planting trees. How do we ensure that we are improving the biodiversity and increasing the resilience of our land? And the final thing is we must build networks and mentorship platforms for knowledge exchange so that women take advantage. She spoke about her mentor. Ako is a Burji name for grandmother. My friend is her grandmother, so has taught her how to plant trees. Are we teaching? Who's teaching? No one taught me to plant trees. I don't even think I know where to begin. So how do we build networks for mentorship and learn across? An organization that I had called the Center for Global South Initiatives in Development has set up what we call the Idea Bridge that bridges Latin America and Africa. How can we learn across those sectors? And then finally, the issue of women's leadership, agricultural, sustainability, agri-food systems, all these are interconnected, and it's come through as we've spoken from the start of this conversation. But many times when these conversations happen, this room should be very full because agriculture feeds us. But when we look at it from a women's rights or even a feminist perspective, then this is considered the work of Dr. Carrier and Award. It is not seen in the mainstream business of work that we do. So how do we begin to build on intersectionality? And that's a challenge that I'm taking forward and we will take forward as Femnet, because all these things are interconnected. When we're speaking about gender norms, when we speak about violence, and I'll give a quick story about the women in Kisi, for example, who are killed on accusations of witchcraft. They're not killed because they're witches. They're killed because somebody wants the rich agricultural land in Kisi, and these women are vulnerable. So how do we make sure that these interconnections are clear so that we support each other and build forward stronger? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think what is really standing out from your intervention is that this is not just a peripheral issue. It's a fundamental issue. It's really central to the development agenda. And I think what is clearly coming out, we are running out of time. So clearly 75 minutes are not enough for us to discuss these issues in them. And the challenge for us is to continue these conversations. This is just a conversation starter. To continue with these conversations, I'm happy to hear that you're taking on the challenge for Femnet, and we think this is what we'll continue doing. The question here is, what will you continue doing when you go back to your institutions or during the rest of this week? We've talked about platforms. I think this is a really important platform for expanding our networks. As we bring this to a close, I'd like to invite Dr. Carolina Rubiro from IDRC, who is going to close for us and give us the reflections. What are you hearing?
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to represent Canada's International Development Research Center. And IDRC has been a long-standing partner of award, so I wanted to start with that recognition. For years, we have partnered with award to seed and grow women's leadership in agricultural science, mentoring scholars, building research networks, and supporting evidence that changes policies and practice. And that relationship matters to us because when women led, as we just heard, And that means from farms, to labs, to value chains, to ministries, agri-food systems really become more productive, more resilient, and more just. And that has been, I think, clearly stated by all our esteemed panelists. So the event was anchored in this important report. So it's been an evidence-based conversation on women in agri-food systems. And I think it's a key reminder that it's why sustained intelligent investment in women leadership is not kind of an add-on or something that is nice to have, just like a representational issue, but it's foundational to livelihoods, to food security and climate resilience. And what I wanted to focus in my closing remarks was something that I thought wouldn't surface so clearly as it had in the panel. So I said, okay, this is going to be my contribution to the conversation. But actually, it's great that I heard this. I think in every statement by the panelists, which is the role of unpaid care work. Because when we talk about leadership pipelines or women in STEM or representation, care work doesn't really feature in those conversations. And yet, like as we know, and as it has been said, in rural economies, women face that double workday, right? Participating both in the revenue generating activities, like farming, processing, researching, but also expected to complete the unpaid tasks that ensure the survival of all of us as family members and the operations of the household. And the issue is that when care is invisible and unsupported, it becomes that powerful barrier that reduces women's time, constrains their mobility, their training opportunities, the opportunities for specialization and for professional advancement as well. So that is a key barrier that helps explain the persistence gaps across the system. So I think it's really important that we focus on the systemic issues that explain the gaps that were presented. And the paradox, of course, is that care is also that key work that sustains life and underwrites any other forms of work in agriculture. So I think that recognizing that duality changes what we measure, what we finance, how we design things. So if we take a broader perspective of the meaning of leadership, then I think our job is to help, of course, extraordinary women as all the ones that we has heard break the glass ceilings, but it's also about breaking the sticky floors and the structural limits that press down on the menu. And this starts by recognizing, reducing, redistributing, and rewarding care, and by supporting the caregivers, which are the peoples that makes all the other labor possible. And of course, behind that is what was also mentioned multiple times in the panel, which is the role of social norms that dictate the social distribution of labor. So from evidence from Latin America, where I come from, so you are wondering why you have a Latin American in this conversation around Africa, and I truly believe on the power of learning and collaboration across our regions. So from evidence from Latin America, but also from Africa, we already see what's possible when women organizations and cooperatives integrate care into agricultural enterprises. Because I think we are talking, fortunately, there is a little bit of a momentum on the care agenda. We are, well, in Latin America, there is a lot of progress in some countries now, which we have to safeguard, because of course there's also a lot of backlash in our countries, but we don't see that much of a conversation on the link between care and agriculture. And I think that's a key agenda that I would like us to explore together. And this is why for IDRC, it's important that we are investing actively in gender transformative care agenda in Africa on our Scaling Care Innovations in Africa program, and we partner with Pernet on that as well. And in Latin America, through collaborative research funds that facilitate partnerships between researchers and policymakers to scale care policies in the region, we also work on the climate and care nexus, which is an agenda that I do think is crucial for thinking and informing truly the meaning of a truly just transition. And the idea behind this is that we need to make care work visible, valued, and financed so that budget, business models, and the policies change accordingly. And that's why our collaboration with our remains so important. Because mentoring, research excellence, institutional change travel farther and faster when they ride on the systems that recognize and support care. So just to close, I wanted to thank all the panelists for the amazing contributions. I think this is a conversation that we need to have more, and to also, to your point, start maybe inviting other types of movements to join the agricultural conversation. So I came more, as you can see, from the care movement. But I think it's only when we work across movements and we build those bridges between movements that we are going to finally start seeing impact so that our sons and daughters have a better world. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for these remarks and for ending by emphasizing the need to pay more attention to the paid care work. It's not just an issue, it's actually a macroeconomic issue that really we need to give it the attention that it deserves. So thank you very much, ladies, and we still have gentlemen in the room. Thank you for staying with us up to the end. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think there's opportunity for you to continue engaging with each other. I'd like to thank my panelists for preparing and for accepting to help us have this conversation. It's been such an honor moderating this conversation, and I hope that we've all learned something new, or at least identified where we want to continue investing more on, or what we want to continue amplifying. And so have a good evening. Thank you. May I invite my panelists to kindly take a photo? Yes.
Please all join the celebration of the International Year of the Woman Farmer tomorrow in the conference room 2 at 11:30. Starting at 11:30.
It's interesting that you can